I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. How do you feel when you hear the word sensitive? Is it triggering? When I think about the word sensitive, I think about women, I think about PMS, I think about hormones, I think about that word being applied as a negative to talk about the way that we sometimes feel during our monthly cycle. I want to spend some time today talking with you about PMS and what our theories are around how our hormone changes influence what's going on in our nervous system and what's going on in our brain, to help you understand that the word sensitive really could not be more appropriate to, explain what's happening for us as women hormonally in our brains and what's going on that causes those symptoms. And I want us to reclaim that word as something that we are not going to be triggered by, because it's not necessarily negative to be sensitive. And also the situation that's happening with our women and with PMS is best described by using the word sensitivity. And I'm going to share with you today how our modern lifestyle, how our stress, and how, all the things are coming together to influence what's going on with our hormone experience. And that word sensitive, we're going to hang on to because it really helps us understand what your PMS experience is about. My interest in this conversation mostly comes from my own experience of women's health, my own experience of hormone change, and how that has had an impact on my mood, my productivity, and how that has then, as a consequence, completely shaped my career because I became so deeply interested in this topic. So I do recall back in my younger years where, I spent a lot of time on some kind of contraception, didn't understand my menstrual cycle, didn't understand how my hormones influenced my mood. I at one time was on the Depo-Provera shot, which those of you that are in their late 30s or 40s, you may have been offered that as a really standard, simple birth control option where you got this injection every 3 months. And, looking back at my life at that time, those were not my healthiest years. Those were years where I was really fatigued, really didn't show up completely or fully in my life, and probably was a consequence of that hormone suppression that you experience when you're on the Depo shot. Then went through lots and lots of hormone fluctuation, coming off of those medications. And it took me almost a year to regain some kind of ovulation. My brain was just literally not interested in regaining ovulation function after that. And so there was so much of my youth where I was medicated, and PMS technically doesn't happen during those times. So when we suppress ovulation, women don't have PMS. They can absolutely have symptoms that look and sound and quack like PMS, like low mood or bloating or breast tenderness. But that true complex of PMS actually requires you to ovulate in order for it to fulfill what's actually happening, from a diagnostic criteria perspective. We can't fulfill that without ovulation. But I will say societally, we call a lot of things PMS, right? And it's kind of like this sensitive issue. We call a lot of things us being sensitive about hormones. But the reality is, if you are not ovulating every month, if you are on an oral contraceptive, if you are perimenopausal, you are allowed to have hormone symptoms that affect your mood and your body, but technically it's not premenstrual syndrome unless you have ovulated. So I had never really identified as a person who had PMS. So even when I was, in my younger years and cycling and I was in naturopathic school, I really didn't identify as a person who had PMS. I didn't feel major fluctuations in my mood. I maybe even was, not particularly aware of where my cycle was coming or when my cycle was coming. I didn't track it. That was pre apps on a mobile device. So, but I didn't keep count at all. No idea. But I also recall, like back then, my husband saying, that I didn't struggle with PMS. That wasn't a thing for me. And, him having to experience it all the time, he was probably a pretty good reflection of the stability of my mood and all of those things. And I really didn't experience those monthly shifts when I was in my mid to late 20s. I then had a lot of trauma around miscarriage. I was pregnant 4 times in 8 months and had, really struggled with breastfeeding, struggled with postpartum depression, went back to work really quick after my son was born. And so you'll see as we start to talk about what happens with PMS or what we think is happening at this point, that was probably a bit of a setup for me to experience different changes to the way I feel when my hormones shift at that time. So this kind of cluster F of multiple pregnancies and losses, then pregnancy where I was very stressed through the entire pregnancy, thinking I was going to miscarry, then very difficult newborn, did not sleep for longer than 2 or 3 hours for over a year. Really significant struggle with mood at that time. And then also really quick return to work. I went back to work when my son was 6 weeks old. So, even just on paper, you can look at all of that and say, in air quotes, that's awfully stressful, right? That period of time is awfully stressful. And what we're going to talk about today, or what I want to enlighten you to, is why we think women become sensitive to their hormones. So, what actually happens in our bodies and in our brains that take the super stable 22-year-old who's cycling, who doesn't even know when her period is coming, to the, 35, 39-year-old, 42-year-old woman who feels every single shift in her hormones. I want to walk you through why that happens because it will help you figure out what the action plan needs to look like for you to start to get better. We've talked about the different phases of the menstrual cycle before and how to try and leverage those different states in other episodes. But the basic gist of the menstrual cycle is it's a beautifully timed event that takes approximately 28 days to complete. The first half is called the follicular phase. That's where your estrogen levels are low, but like nice and low. They're not too low, they're low-ish. And they grow or increase throughout that follicular phase. Progesterone, our other female hormone, is non-existent, not present during that time. The follicle is being grown at that time, and then around ovulation, there is a big hormone trigger that is partially induced by increasing levels of estrogen, and that follicle is released. That high level of estrogen tapers off a little bit, right? So it lowers back down. And then estrogen rises again through the rest of that second half, which is called the luteal phase, and is met with an increase in progesterone, which is made by the ovulated, or it's made by the tissue that's left behind in the ovary after the egg is ovulated. So during that second half, or that luteal phase, both estrogen and progesterone are dominant. They are both present. During the ovulation phase, estrogen is really the predominant hormone, but there is a really sharp rise and then fall back down after ovulation before the two, estrogen and progesterone, kind of rise back up together. That ebb and flow that's happening, really one of the biological purposes of all of that, of course, is reproduction. And so the uterine lining is grown and then shed in sequence. There are other pieces of that sort of reproductive pathway that are happening as a consequence of estrogen and progesterone. But both of those hormones do other very positive things. And we've talked about both hormones at length in other episodes around what happens mostly when they go away, right? What happens in perimenopause or what happens in menopause when both of those hormones are either haphazardly produced, which is what happens in perimenopause, or when they, leave in menopause. So we've talked about that in other episodes. But both hormones are very positive, and it's easy when we start to talk about PMS to point our finger at the hormones, right? To say, hey, like this fluctuation in hormones is making me feel bad. These elevated levels of these hormones are making me feel bad. And often we will see information online about you needing to lower your hormones or your hormones being a big problem. And what I want you to come away from this episode understanding is that we love our hormones. We want them there. We need them. Ovulation is necessary. The health benefits of ovulation are way beyond just talking about fertility. And even though that PMS week is difficult, and we'll talk about why that is in a second, it is really important that we make those hormones for the big picture of our health. So I became very interested in all of this, well into my 30s, where I started to notice personally that I struggled more with hormone fluctuation than I ever had before. So where I maybe didn't notice that I had ovulated in the past, I was starting to have a cluster of days that sucked. And part of it was pointed out by my partner. Part of it was pointed out by friends, where they would notice that there would be this distinct phase of time in the month where I was not doing that great. And I still didn't track my cycle at that time. Like I still was not, because it was just never part of my health history that I needed to. And I hadn't been on the pill or anything where I ever needed to count anything for such a long time. And even my second pregnancy with my daughter was a surprise. So I never did the, write down where we are every day, temperature tracking. That just wasn't part of my health history. But I had people pointing out that there was a cluster of time where every month where I was not doing that great. And so I did start tracking and started to figure out that there was definitely this defined window in my luteal phase that I did not feel well. And so this is where my interest got sparked, right? I dove into the literature on the topic. I picked apart every global consensus paper about PMS to look at what other countries were doing. I wanted to know what they were prescribing in Germany. I wanted to know how that compared to what we were doing in Canada. I looked at, how many women go see a gynecologist in the United States for PMS versus in Canada. It's a two-step process for you to see a gynecologist. And I looked at all of these pieces. I found it completely fascinating because it's such a high prevalence in the female population that at least 90% of women, at least at some point in their life, are going to identify as having PMS symptoms. But also the care for PMS seemed to differ depending on where you lived. And it's so debilitating, right? So even thinking about myself, I consider myself to be like a high-performing woman. And yet there were these days per month that I was not particularly productive or functional or friendly. I really wanted to spend some time at that and look at that and figure out what those gaps are. So one of the things that became awfully apparent when I started to research into PMS, and to be perfectly honest, we have not studied this as much as we should, considering 90% of women in their lifetime will experience this, is that there's a common theme of stress being in the history of women who identify as having PMS symptoms. Now, the research, the farther back we go, the research is more extreme. So, meaning that the stressors were more extreme. So, women who suffered from sexual abuse were more likely to have PMS later in life. Women who had been neglected as kids were more likely to suffer from both PMS and PMDD, which is the more psychiatric hormonal condition that is often discussed alongside PMS. Women who had any kind of traumatic event were more likely to be diagnosed with PMS. So the research was starting to show that the stress response of women being activated either really severely from like maybe a single event that was significant or chronically was starting to shape the way that she experiences her hormones. It was in essence changing her sensitivity to this monthly process that had been happening all along. And it wasn't until her stress response and her female hormones started to get deeply connected did we start to see the incidence of her PMS increase. The research since then, I would say, has not evolved to the place that I want to see it, but it's converging on this theme, meaning that every study that we do on this topic of stress and PMS is confirming that the more stress that a woman has in her life, the more trauma she has in her life, the greater her PMS severity and the greater her PMS experience. And that's really important. When I started to look at that in my own health history, it made sense when I could look at those 3, 4, 5 years that were so difficult, right? I also was finishing up my professional schooling when all of that hormonal chaos was happening. All my miscarriages were in my last year of school. When I started to look at that in my own personal history, and then I started to listen to the stories of the woman in front of me, I could see there was this huge correlation between women being in their 30s and 40s, being, burning the candle, well, lighting the entire candle on fire, basically, in their lives, and having these worsening and worsening experiences of PMS. And that's really what kind of triggered my interest in looking at this. So, what we think is happening in the brain of women with PMS is that we're actually developing a differential sensitivity. So, that's the term that we use in the research, differential sensitivity to a normal hormone fluctuation through the month. So, that's the word sensitive. This is the one that I want us to hang on to because the women's cycle didn't change, right? Her ability to ovulate didn't change, her ovulation didn't change. And the big picture of those hormones that she produces, the estrogen, progesterone, the big picture of those hormones also didn't change. She still did it, right? She still did all the steps of the 28-day menstrual cycle, except now the actual experience of that luteal phase is intolerable in her body. And so we think that the nervous system of women with PMS is being altered by her stress, by perhaps other lifestyle factors, and it's making her be triggered mentally, emotionally, and then as a consequence, there's some physical changes with PMS that are happening because of this marriage between her HPA axis, which is your stress response, the cortisol pathway basically, and her female hormones. They're getting married, the two of them, in those times of trauma and high distress. And it's creating this future relationship that ovulation is now stressful, right? So put very basically, PMS is a woman's brain feeling like something that's supposed to happen is an absolute catastrophe. And so the mood symptoms, the irritability, the changes in her ability to read facial expressions in other people, that like emotional fragility and sensitivity in conversation is because your brain is starting to view her experience in her body as threatening and as stressful. And it tilts us towards being hyper aware of what's going on and irritable. And it also influences other hormones in our body, which is causing the water retentions and some of the other physical symptoms we get with PMS. So what about testing, right? This question comes up often is, can we test women for PMS? Can we test women for their hormones? And, testing for PMS really needs to just confirm that that's what we're talking about by ruling out other things. So, what I tell women often is that we can't line up 100 women's lab work and point to who has PMS. We can't differentiate between women who have PMS and women who don't just by looking at their lab work. So, of course, the question of relevance, do we do it, does come up, right? And I think if you're struggling, and I always think how does the listening woman get started on this journey? So you can be tested, but mostly the testing should be to rule out other things, because those symptoms of PMS, of fatigue and irritability and bloating, can be caused by other stuff. So that's really what we should be doing. If you're older and you think you might be going through perimenopause, those symptoms can look and feel an awful lot like true PMS symptoms. Sometimes lab work can help us differentiate you from women who have PMS. But the reality is that the lab work isn't going to confirm or deny your experience. So that curious woman now who's listening, you need to track your symptoms. We've talked about that multiple times before in the podcast about the importance of tracking your symptoms. But that's is really how we help women with PMS get started on their journey, is for them to actually track it. We actually don't do a great job of looking backwards and saying, yeah, I was irritable in my PMS window, which is why I even personally needed someone else to point it out to me, because it wasn't blatantly obvious to me what days of the month it was happening. It wasn't until I started tracking it that I could see really consistently that, day 18 was do not pass go, get in bed kind of day. I didn't see that until I started tracking. So that's really how you get started. Now, some of the research has dove deep on those hormone changes to try and figure out what on earth is going on with women who have PMS or women who have PMDD. We know that the hormones are triggering the issue. And we do see that there is some slight variation in hormone levels in women who have PMS and PMDD, but it's not obvious enough that we can pick it up on lab work. And it's also temporary, right? If you think one of the issues that we have in testing women who are in their cycle or around their menstrual cycle is that your hormones are different every single day of the week. So if we wanted to try and test you on Tuesday, your hormones are going to be different on Monday and then different again on Wednesday. So it's really hard to interpret, is that estrogen at its highest? Is it at its lowest? Or is that a medium number? We don't know that. Whereas in the research, they'll test women every single day, right? It's just not practical for us to do that in the real world. But if we test women every single day, we can see that women who have PMS or women who have PMDD actually have lower levels of estrogen in the early part of their luteal phase. And they may have, by comparison, higher levels of progesterone than women who don't struggle with their mood around their cycle. And that's kind of an interesting finding, because in PMDD, we know that those hormone levels are influencing what's happening with the neurotransmitters in those women's brain. And so it's not completely shocking that we see that those hormone levels have shifted a little bit in women who are struggling with their mood. But the more important take home is that it is actually just the sensitivity of your estrogen going up and down and your progesterone going up and down. That's the problem, not whichever particular number they happen to land on. It's the shift that's the problem. You are sensitive to the change in estrogen. You're sensitive to the change in progesterone. And so that term differential sensitivity acknowledges that women don't all feel the same when their hormones look the same. Like I said, if we line up 100 women's lab work, I can't tell you who has PMS. And in medicine, that is awfully hard for us. I mean, us, as a community, not me, because we like cutoffs, right? We like a reference range. We like to say black, white, you're high, low, good, bad, yes, no. And what we're acknowledging by saying there's a differential sensitivity is that we're saying that your experience is your experience. Full stop. That's it. Nothing more to say. If you have PMS, it doesn't matter what your hormone levels are, you have PMS. And in a culture of medicine where women generally don't feel that heard, you can imagine how infrequently we are diving in deep on this conversation and how little support we are giving women. In a 7-minute conversation, does your doctor get to ask you about your burnout or your level of distress or the trauma you experienced from having repetitive miscarriages and then having to pump breast milk in a university bathroom while you tried to go back to work when your son was 6 weeks old? Right? You don't get to have that conversation and that experience in a conventional setting. And so it's really under assessing, it's under discussing this whole issue. And 90% of women are going to have at least one PMS episode in their lifetime. So the narrative around this needs to change, right? For two reasons. One, we need to stop normalizing it because it's happening for a reason, right? It's happening because women's bodies are moving through stress and not recovering from it. And that may be due to a change in resiliency for women over time. It may mean that our bandwidth, is being exceeded by our life. There are some countries, nations, cultures that don't have as much PMS as we do in North America. Do we chalk that up to our North American diet or our North American life? Probably a little bit of both. But the moment we start to normalize distress in all patients, we stop looking for solutions, right? We stop supporting those women and looking at the fact that our stress is part of the trigger. The lack of support is enabling this to become a bigger, more global problem for women in general versus us actively seeking solutions for it. If we stopped tolerating women not feeling well half of the month and started to actively look for ways to give her infrastructure and support and advice that helped her be more functional, we say like my big mission in my career and life is to help women feel well all the time so that they can show up more fully in their lives. There are politicians out there with PMS. There are women who are scientists who are advancing medicine. There are women out there who are being part of climate change and anti-racism who feel like garbage half the month. And I just can't have that, right? We can't have those women not showing up in their work in their fullest. And we know that PMS influences her capacity to do her job. And so when I think about our biggest goal, or my biggest goal, is for those women and all of you to feel more well all the time so that you can show up fully in your life. And if we stop normalizing the experience, then we start to look for solutions as a group. And so I want us to change the narrative on that conversation that it's just part of being a woman to be sensitive to your hormones. It's not true. It's our life that's made us sensitive to our hormones. It's our trauma. It's the abuse that women have endured. It's the neglect that women have endured that increases their risk of PMS. They're not, magically becoming sensitive to a normal biological process. Our life is being interwoven with that hormone experience in such a way that is causing significant distress in her brain and her body. And so we have to take that sort of bird's eye view and look at how we would offer women in general more support so that that doesn't happen. So we have to stop normalizing the experience of PMS because, like I said, then we start to look for answers. If women feel victimized by their PMS, then they, as an individual, don't start looking for answers and solutions. And so it's incredibly important that women know that this is not normal, that women know that there are solutions out there for her so that she can be active in that process of finding some solutions. The other thing that I think we need to do, which goes along with not normalizing the experience, is that we need to start viewing PMS as a signal that we're flirting with burnout, right? Or that we are starting to exceed our own bandwidth for what we're capable of in this moment for stress. So if women looked at their PMS as this tip of the iceberg, that their setup, their life, their support, their infrastructure actually was setting them up for that failure, that level of distress when she ovulates, I think we would be a bit more empowered to try and seek change. But women in general are sort of trapped in busyness, in perfection, in performance, in our self-worth being tied up in lots of things, right? That maybe are not all health driven, right? They're not all things that if we focus on all of those things at once, right? How combed our kids' hair is, how healthy the lunch is, how well we execute on a particular task at work, we often will see an increase in PMS. But rather than viewing that as a symptom of overwork or a symptom of burnout, we repel it, right? Or we won't acknowledge it. We don't acknowledge it as being this whisper from our body that something needs to shift. We then just white knuckle it through the presentation, baking, laundry, hit class, and force ourselves to show up maybe even more than we would if we felt well, because it's like we don't want to be held back by our hormone experience. And that just becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of women feeling worse and worse over time. The last thing I want to talk about is to reflect a little bit on what I've noticed in the last year from the various stressors that women have endured because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I walk with women in stressful moments in their life all the time, right? So the changing jobs, moving houses, divorce, losing a loved one, right? I have supported women in various aspects or various times in my career, especially because I have long relationships with the women I work with. So in that 2, 3, 5 year period that I'm spending supporting a woman on her health journey, of course, she's going to have major life events and major sort of issues and traumas that show up for her. And I've always anecdotally been able to see that women struggled with their hormones and with their symptoms in the months following a stressful event, right? You could see sometimes she would just even straight up miss a period after a stressful life event. But there was a big connection in her PMS, in her bloating, in her mood, how sensitive she felt around a stressful time in her life. Now, in March 2020, when all of the world shut down and there was so much uncertainty, there was the transition for online learning or no school, no daycare for many women, their level of responsibility during the day was 100-fold. Their level of support was ripped out from underneath them. And layering on top of that, of course, the fear and uncertainty of the actual pandemic itself. I watched 100% of my patients all be stressed about the same thing at the same time. And I will say that nothing has reinforced for me the impact that stress has on hormones as watching my patient population navigate their PMS symptoms and just all hormone symptoms in general over the last 10 months through the pandemic. I have watched women who've never experienced PMS before suddenly report symptoms. I have watched women that we had beautifully managed her PMS through various strategies over the years have a return of all of her symptoms. I also watched women who were beautifully managed for her menopause have a return of her hot flashes, or a woman who we maybe didn't see perimenopause coming on the horizon for her at all be thrown into a perimenopause experience. So for what it's worth, and I know that that is not a research study, and I am very in favor of research studies, but for what it's worth, and if this helps you understand your last 10 months, is that I would say the vast majority of my patients have seen a worsening of their hormone symptoms in the last 10 months. And only when we started to support them from a stress perspective, and really, like, we're still knee deep in the entire circumstance from the pandemic. And so when I say we're helping support those women, it's temporary crutches to help her try and make it through. But only when we started to help her with her exercise, her nutrition, get back on track, be diligent about the self-care, the meditation, the gratitude work, the outside walking. It was only then did we start to see some recovery or decrease in her symptoms. And so if you're listening to this and you've struggled over the last year, or if the last year feels like it's this oddity in your experience of how you have navigated your hormones before, that's not a unique experience. I've watched that in all my patients over the last 10 months. The last thought I want to leave you with in this episode is thinking about that word sensitive. And I latched onto it for this episode, I think, because to me, it just felt so ironic that the way that we're describing what happens in the brain of women with PMS is the same word that we use societally to talk about women who are struggling with PMS. And if you've ever been called sensitive during your PMS window, and if you didn't have smoke coming out of your ears and flames being thrown out of your eyeballs, that's, to me, that's the experience of being labeled sensitive. But if we think about the word in a different way, right? If we can step back and maybe not feel triggered by it or not feel personally targeted by the word sensitive, what it's really trying to do is remind us just how much balance is needed in our body. It reminds us that our health plan needs to be moving towards achieving peace in our nutrition, peace in our exercise, peace in our minds, peace in our schedule, and that we as women are sensitive to extreme. We're sensitive to being too busy. We're sensitive to trauma. We're sensitive to undereating. We're sensitive to alcohol. We're sensitive because those things, even if they feel on paper like it's something that we, air quotes, should be able to tolerate, that's not actually where we thrive. We thrive when we move our health plan and our life and our mindset towards greater peace. So when I look at the word sensitive in a different light, in a more loving light, it reminds me that I want to keep moving towards some sort of life that has more peace, right? Peace as the goal. Because what that does is it lets that very simple hormonal fluctuation not be felt like an absolute catastrophe in our brains. And we all would be able to show up better if that was the case. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their health care. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast, where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their health care. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.